Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in the Geneva Press Club. Welcome to those following us online. Of course, it is a great pleasure for us here in Geneva Press Club to welcome Jusoor International Center for Media and Development in the Geneva Press Club. And it's a great pleasure and honor, especially to welcome its founder and president, the journalist and writer, Mr. Mohamed Al-Hammadi. Jusoor International was created here in Geneva, Switzerland, in 2019. This international NGO has the important mission to advancing positive practices and in media and human development. Jusoor International works to build bridges and foster dialogue among global professionals, jurists, media experts. Its focus includes systemic change initiatives in the MENA region, partnerships with the UN, and advocacy for human rights. And I have now the pleasure to introducing Mr. Mohamed Al-Hammadi, founder and president of Jusoor International, for a welcoming statement. Mr. Al-Hammadi is not only a journalist, a writer, a speaker, but also an expert in media issues, and as well as international relations in the field of human rights. He has held different prominent positions, including editor-in-chief of Al-Ittihad newspaper, director of editing and publishing at Abu Dhabi Media Company, editor-in-chief of National Geographic's Arabic edition, and as well as editor-in-chief of Al Raya newspaper. It's a pleasure and honor to welcome you here, Mr. Al-Hammadi, and sir, you have the floor for a short welcoming word.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Honor of us, we are very happy in Jusoor International for Media and Development to be with you here, to be in Geneva, to talk about one of very important topics. We think it's important to talk about it in this time. Our colleagues in the world and our colleagues in our Middle East, journalists under attack, those people who's working for truth and who's working under fire, as we said, just to send us and to bring for us the truth and what happened on the ground. Today, I would welcome all of you and all our speakers here. Thank you very much to attending. Thank you very much to be with us today to talk about these topics and to be honest and to be clear when we talk about this issue in this time, to know and to try to help our colleagues everywhere. Thank you very much again, and we hope you enjoy this session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Hammadi. I have now the pleasure of introducing Mr. Jean-Philippe Jutzi. Mr. Jean-Philippe Jutzi is the Vice President of Presse-Emblem campaign. Jean-Philippe Jutzi will speak about the current state of journalist safety. Mr. Jutzi is a Swiss journalist and communication advisor. He has over 25 years of experience in print media, particularly in international and national politics. Throughout his career, he has held various leadership roles, including deputy-in-chief at 24 Heures and various positions at Le Matin and La Liberté, which are Switzerland's medias. He also served as president of the Vaud Journalist Association, and he currently holds prominent positions within the International Francophone Press Union. Beyond journalism, Jean-Philippe Jutzi spent 5 years in humanitarian aid with mission in conflict and crisis zones all across the globe, including Mozambique, Pakistan, and Haiti. His expertise in crisis communication later led him to diplomatic roles within the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he acted as the spokesperson for the Swiss foreign minister. He also held cultural advisory positions in Switzerland's embassies, both in France and China. In addition to his extensive media and diplomatic work, Jean-Philippe Jutzi has been active in cultural communication, non-profit leadership, and humanitarian development. Jean-Philippe Jutzi, thank you for joining us from Lausanne. Jean-Philippe, you have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for this very impressive introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Mr. Al-Hammadi. Thanks for giving me the floor for this presentation of Press Emblem campaign. First of all, let me introduce you briefly our organization. As a global media safety and rights body, PEC is a non-governmental organization with special consultative status at the United Nations. PEC, founded in June 2004 by a group of journalists from several countries based in Geneva, is an international independent non-profit organization. Created in the wake of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by US troops and in the wake of other conflicts shaking up the global geostrategic order, it aims at strengthening the legal protection and safety of journalists around the world. PEC activities are made possible by the personal commitment of the professional journalists who have volunteered to serve on its board, currently made up of 8 people. Membership in PEC implies acceptance of the objectives as stated in the statutes of the association. It's open to all journalists, either as individuals or through their journalist associations, as well as to media organizations, members of governmental and non-governmental organizations, and to private individuals desirous of supporting our goals. Currently, some 60 journalists and media associations and syndicates from 5 continents support the PEC activities. To carry out its advocacy work and promote the safety and protection of journalists in general, and in conflict zone in particular, PEC has 2 representatives at the United Nations in Geneva. They can intervene in the general debates at each session of the Human Rights Council. PEC has also a network of correspondents in several regions of the world, including India for South Asia, Mali for Sub-Saharan Africa, and Ukraine. This network is completed by regional relays in 12 countries. Let's go to the heart of today's topic, namely the current situation of journalists working in conflict or war zones. First observations. Since 2010, the number of wars and armed conflicts worldwide has risen significantly, reaching worrying levels in recent years. The number of armed conflicts reached a record high in 2023, with 59 recorded. That's the highest number since 1946. This upward trend has been observed for several years. Africa is the region most affected, with 28 conflicts in 2023. It means almost half of the world total. Next come Asia, 17 conflicts, the Middle East, 10, Europe, 3, and the Americas, 1. Since 2022, conflicts such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza have dramatically worsened the situation. Conflicts are also becoming increasingly complex, with a growing number of belligerents active within a single country. This is due in particular to the spread of the Islamic State group and the growing involvement of non-state actors such as jihadists group or drug cartels in South America, mainly Colombia and Mexico. This makes it also more difficult for the media to intervene. Let's take a look at what data and information PEC is able to collect, how it does it, and what it's used for. Many other media organizations keep track of the number of journalists killed in the course of their work. Where PEC makes a difference is that it lists all the media representatives who have died. The spectrum is broader than that established by other international journalist organizations, since it includes the technicians and ancillary professions without whom information could not circulate. I'll just give you an example. During the COVID crisis in 2020-2022, PEC included in its statistics journalists who died as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, since they were no longer able, obviously, to do their job of informing and investigating the said pandemic. PEC includes in its statistics murders and cases of death, of serious injury or unlawful interference with their work among journalists, media employees, correspondents, freelancers, cameramen, technicians, photographers, producer, media administrators, all these kinds of professionals. The figures do not register casualties among other media employees like guards, security staff, and drivers, etc. To summarize these statistics, which are certainly macabre but essential for alerting public opinion and the authorities to the situation of journalists, PEC issues a report each year in January. For 2023, the findings are stark, with 140 journalists killed. This year has been the deadliest since 2012. In addition to keeping statistics and advocating for press freedom and the protection of journalists, PEC awards a prize for the protection of journalists. This one is given annually to reward a person or an organization who worked for the protection of journalists and the press freedom on the ground. The prize has been awarded regularly since 2009. You can find the list on PEC website. This year, in view of Israel's war in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Lebanon, following the Hamas attacks on October 7, 2023, the prize will be awarded on next November 20 to the Gazan journalist and filmmaker Iyad Al-Astal. Another question asked in this panel is highlighting the importance of international advocacy for journalist safety. In addition to publicizing and denouncing cases of violence, violations against press freedom, intimidation, unjustified arrests, attack on freedom of expression and of the press, and torture, PEC intervenes at the level of international organization, in particular in the UN Human Rights Council, to ensure that these fundamental freedoms of the journalist profession are respected. All this advocacy and information dissemination work is, of course, only valuable as the action of collaborative efforts between media organizations, governments, and NGOs in order to improve global press freedom. Another important aspect of PEC activities is the support of the drafting of an international convention on the protection of journalists in dangerous areas, including the creation of independent commissions of inquiry, reparations for victims, and the creation of a single optional press emblem. This is our fundamental proposal. The International Federation of Journalists supports the idea of such a convention. One final point I'd like to raise with you concerns precisely the very name of our organization, Press Emblem Campaign, as mentioned above. From the outset, PEC has been strongly committed, notably at the level of international organizations, to the introduction of a sign, an emblem, that all media representatives could or should wear in the exercise of their profession in conflict or war zone. This would ensure their identification, protection, and safety in the same way as humanitarian workers. However, this is important. In today's hybrid warfare, wearing a distinctive press badge is no longer a means of protection. It could even be rather a means of targeting. That's the reason why we insist on the fact that this emblem should be optional according to each specific situation. That's also why it's essential to fight against impunity to ensure respect for international humanitarian law by prosecuting and judging those who violated it. The examples of Gaza today are the most striking proof of this. This could be a topic for discussion, maybe during the exchange that we'll have a bit later this afternoon. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe. As you said, PEC is giving its 2024 award next month, and will of course not fail to follow this important news. Now direction Gaza. We are now about to hear a first-hand account of the physical, emotional, and legal dangers journalists face on the ground, and of the specific challenges in Palestine and other conflict zones. This account comes from Mohamed Sawaf. Mohamed Sawaf is an independent Palestinian journalist and filmmaker, and the founder of Aleph Multimedia, based in Palestine. He has directed over 30 documentary films, which have earned numerous awards and recognition at international festivals, such as the Royal Television Society Award for Television Journalism in the UK, the Edward Murrow Award, or the Gold Medal at this year New York Film Festival. He also received awards for his films The World at a Crossroads and his other film 11 Days in May. Mohamed Sawaf experienced the latest Israeli war in Gaza firsthand, during which he himself has already directed and produced several films. He was himself seriously injured and lost many members of his family during the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. He is right now in Gaza. He recorded for us this video just a few days ago. Listen to him, please.
مرحبا بكم. محمد الصواف صحفي وصانع أفلام مقيم في مدينة غزة وبالتحديد شمال قطاع غزة حاليا. أنا أشكر لكم فرصة التحدث في مؤتمركم وندوتكم هذه. عندما أرسلت لي المحاور التي يمكن أن أتحدث بضوئها عن واقع الصحفيين الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة، وجدت أنه لا يمكن بحال من الأحوال أن أتجاوز الحرب الإبادة التي نتعرض لها في قطاع غزة منذ أكثر من عام. لأنه قبل الحرب الإسرائيلية أي خطر أو تهديد كان يهدد الصحفيين كان لا يصل إلى حياتهم، خاصة من السلطات المحلية أيا كانت السلطة الفلسطينية أو حركة حماس التي كانت تحكم غزة. لكن في ظل الحرب الإسرائيلية على غزة لا يوجد أي قدرة على حماية الصحفيين، لا يوجد أي صحفي. يعني تقريبا أنا أتحدث عن 95%، تقريبا 2 مليون فلسطيني هجروا من أماكنهم، وبالتالي الصحفيين كل صحفي محلي له عائلة وله أسرة وله أطفال ملزم أن يحميهم ونوفر لهم الحماية، ثم يوفر له لنفسه الحماية حتى يتمكن من تغطية الأحداث التي تجري هنا، في ضوء عدم السماح لأي صحفي أجنبي أو غير فلسطيني التواجد ونقل الأحداث. لا على حسب علمه لا يوجد أي زميل صحفي لم يخرج من بيته، لم ينزح من بيته أكثر من مرة. عدد كبير من الصحفيين أصيبوا، أكثر من 170 صحفي قتل، من ضمنهم أخواي، وأنا كنت من ضمن الجرحى الذين أقعدتهم الصواريخ الإسرائيلية بعد إصابتي إصابة مباشرة وفقدان عدد كبير من أفراد عائلتي. الاحتلال استهدف مكاتب الصحفيين ومكاتب وكالات الأنباء منذ الأيام أو الأسابيع الأولى للعدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة. مكتبنا قصف في أول أسبوع. الكثير من مكاتب الصحفيين زي وكالة الأنباء الفرنسية، الAB، مكاتب الجزيرة، لا يوجد مكان أو مكتب صحفي على حسب علمي لم يصاب أو يتضرر خلال الحرب على غزة. ما هي تدابير السلام التي يمكن أن نتخذها؟ خوذة، درع، البحث عن مكان آمن أنطلق منه، ننطلق مع جماعات من الصحفيين ولا نكون فرادى، نرتبط بمؤسساتنا. أي تدبير من تدابير السلامة هذه ما كانت تنفع في ظل الحرب الإسرائيلية والاستهداف الإسرائيلي على غزة. لا يوجد مكان آمن يمكن أن يكون فيه الصحفي، لا مكتبه ولا أي مكان آمن في قطاع غزة ككل. الدرع والخوذة في لحظة من اللحظات أصبحنا نظن أن الصحفي هو مستهدف وهدف عسكري بذاته، فأصبحنا نحن كصحفيين نخاف ارتداؤها، وكثير من زملائي كانوا يخافوا ارتداؤه، وأنا أعرف كثير من زملائي آثروا على خلع بزة الصحافة وخوذة الصحافة حتى لا يصبحوا هدفا للجيش الإسرائيلي. الصحفي الفلسطيني غزة الذي يعمل في قطاع غزة إذا نشر أي معلومة أو أي مقال أو أي تقرير أو أي فيديو ووثق ما يحدث في قطاع غزة، اللوبيات الإسرائيلية هي سيف مسلط عليه. تبدأ في البحث في صفحاته على وسائل الإعلام، في أقربائه، في تحركاته في غزة، وتبدأ بتشويه صورته، حتى أصبح كل صحفي فلسطيني يعمل في قطاع غزة وينشر الحقيقة من قطاع غزة بقدرة قادر، ومن خلال كل اللوبيات الإسرائيلية وجماعات الضغط في أوروبا أصبحوا مرتبطين بحركة ربطتهم بشكل أو بآخر بحركة حماس، وكأنه لتضغط على وسائل الإعلام التي يعملون بها حتى تنهي أو تفك التعاقد معهم أو عنصر من عناصر التخويف ضد الصحفي الفلسطيني حتى يصبح هو رقيب ذاته. كثير من الصحفيين الفلسطينيين فصلوا وتركوا أعمالهم وتعاقداتهم مع صحف أجنبية ووسائل إعلام أجنبية نتيجة تغطيتهم للأحداث في قطاع غزة وتسلط اللوبيات الإسرائيلية عليهم ونشر وافتراءات أكاذيب عليهم وربطهم بحركة حماس هنا في قطاع غزة. منذ البداية عملت وكالات الأنباء الكبرى ووسائل الإعلام الكبرى على سحب موظفيها من شمال قطاع غزة إلى الجنوب ثم إلى الخارج، وبدأت تعتمد على الصحفيين الذين لا ظهر لهم ولا وسيلة إعلام ولا مؤسسة ينتمون إليها، لأنه لو حدث له شيء فلن تتحمل ولن تتكفل المؤسسة بعلاجه أو تبني أسرته أو حتى الوقوف في ظهره إلا عبر بيان يتيم هنا أو هناك. نحن كصحفيين في غزة لا نستطيع حتى نشر كل شيء، يعني أعرف أنه هناك في طائرات تحوم في الجو ستقصفني في أي لحظة، لأن أنا أشاهد الصحفيين يتساقطون أمام أعيني. كثير من الصحفيين الفلسطينيين باتوا أو المصورين على بحد بشكل أساسي باتوا لا يحملون كاميراتهم، يعتمدوا على على الموبايلات في تغطية الأحداث، ليس فقط لسرعة التوثيق، أيضا لأن الكاميرا أصبحت ترهب الصحفي وترهب الناس، لأن وجود كاميرا يعني يمكن في أي لحظة أن يتم استهداف الصحفي حامل هذه الكاميرا. الجميع يحمل موبايلات. ماذا عن الأطر الدولية والمؤسسات الدولية واتفاقيات حقوق اتفاقيات جنيف وكل المواثيق التي ممكن أو تعطي الصحفي اعتبار معين؟ في هذا يعني هو قبل الحرب كان دورها محدود، كثير من الصحفيين الفلسطينيين قتلوا، لكن ولا مرة أنصف الصحفي الفلسطيني، ولا مرة. لا أذكر يعني فضل شناعة قتل، ياسر مرتجى قتل، كثير من الصحفيين دروزة في الضفة الغربية قتل، لا أذكر صحفي فلسطيني تم تعويضه على الأقل. وأنا عملت على أفلام تبعت صحفيين فلسطينيين تعرضوا للقتل على أيدي القوات الإسرائيلية. لكن في هذه الحرب لا يوجد لم يلتزم الاحتلال بأي قانون، نحن نقتل وما زلنا نقتل، وكل فترة يقتل صحفي. ما المطلوب كان من الصحفيين الشجعان الفلسطينيين؟ أن يتركوا التغطية ويموتوا بجانب أسرهم. الكثير آثر لأن الموت موت، سواء غطى أو لم يغطي، فأصبح واجبا عليه أن ينقل الحقيقة. على الأقل صوت الضحايا الموجودون هنا في غزة ينقلهم بعدسته بقلمه، على الأقل أن يموت هو ويموت أبناء شعبه مرئيين، أفضل من أن يموتوا بصمت لا يعرف عنهم الناس شيئا. ما أأمله من المؤسسات التي تعنى بالصحفيين أن تقف في ظهر الصحفيين الفلسطينيين، خاصة الذين لا مؤسسات لهم. إذا شعر المحتل أو الاحتلال الإسرائيلي أو القوات الإسرائيلية أن هناك من يمكن أن يحاسبهم أو يقاضيهم أمام كل صحفي يجرح أو يقتل، بالتأكيد لو وجد أن هناك جدية لدى هذه المؤسسات سيحسب حسابا. لكن الصحفي الفلسطيني أصبح يشعر نفسه بأنه يتيم متروك من الكل، لا يسمع إلا بعض الشعارات وبعض الخطب التي لا أثر لها على الأرض. هذا ما نريده. شكرا لكم.
We have just listened to Mohamed Sawaf, who is a journalist and a filmmaker in Gaza. May I remind you online that you have both English and Arabic translation, and that you will be able to ask your questions, both written and live, both in English or in Arabic too. So let us now open a chapter about effective measures and best practices. The three speakers will be Thomas Mason, Ousman Noor, and Laura Burns. Thomas Mason is a security engineer at OccamSec in New York. Ousman Noor is the co-founder of the Civilian Agenda, and Laura Burns is a journalist, a documentary producer, and director in Belfast. Let me first introduce Thomas Mason, who is a security engineer at OccamSec in New York City. He's joining us online. Thomas Mason's tenure as a security engineer at OccamSec has taken him inside crowded buildings and outside server farms and everything in between. Despite a focus on network and web application penetration testing, Thomas has hands-on experience in LOT security, radio frequency analysis, cryptanalysis, aircraft and satellite communications. In addition to his information security skills and experience, Thomas Mason comes from an applied mathematics background. This deep mathematical knowledge is often an asset in security work, and he frequently contributes to and keeps up to date on a variety of new and old fields, among them network science, cryptography, quantum computing, and, of course, artificial intelligence. On top of his technical background, Thomas has many years of research experience related to journalism, history, and political science, as well as a professional background in open source intelligence. These skills allowed Thomas to conduct rigorous and original analysis on the complex social, institutional, economic, or historical factors that always influence information security. Thomas Mason, thank you for joining us today. I hope you can hear us, and Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, I feel a little bit out of place here talking to you all because unlike you all, I'm not actually a professional journalist, nor have I spent much time at all in war zones. However, what I am is a security engineer and somebody who's spent the last 10 years or so working in a variety of applied fields, dealing with information technology and its uses and misuses. So what I'm here to try to convince you of today is that although security, although information security as we know it and as it's commonly conceived is something that is very, very hard to sustainably achieve for journalists and really for anybody, that there are strategies and there are ways of conducting oneself that can minimize the risks that are present, that are always going to be present whenever you're reporting information organizations or actors don't want you to, which is what you always do when you're an investigative journalist. So there are a number of common misconceptions, I think, to start with, around various security products that one will often hear a lot of talk about in the media or among colleagues or whatnot. There's been a playbook since I got into this field in around 2014 or 2015. There's been a playbook of things that you should have to be secure when you're using digital technology. Most people talk about things like a virtual private network or a VPN, onion routing or Tor, encrypted messaging apps, things like Telegram, Signal, maybe things like secure operating systems. Now, every single one of these has a variety of drawbacks, limitations, and flaws that I can very quickly go over here. We can start quickly with VPNs. A common misconception about VPNs is that they're a security product. They are not. What a VPN is a VPN is a way of outsourcing hiding your identity to an organization that in theory should have more resources to do it, but in practice will rarely have your best interests at heart. A great case in point of the dangers of relying simply on a VPN is a recent scandal involving a technology company, Cape Technologies, which allegedly has a number of murky ties to and history with intelligence agencies, and which has had a history of surreptitiously and quietly buying up VPNs and VPN review sites. Now, many VPN providers like this will simply take your traffic and then quietly sell it to people. There are VPNs that have been known not to do this. I'm not going to plug any of them here, but there's plenty of resources that you can go online and find, people saying good or bad things about them. Encrypted messaging apps is a very similar story. A very popular one up until recently, or even still currently, was Telegram. And Telegram has recently made the news because Telegram has, the CEO of Telegram was recently detained by police, I believe it was in France. Now, if the CEO of a tech company that runs your favorite encrypted messaging service has been detained by police in a foreign country, you have every reason to suspect that those people may have leverage over that person. Your data may no longer be safe. So that brings me, I guess, to another point, which is that a lot of what you will be doing on the internet with using secure products, so-called secure products, is essentially outsourcing your security to people that you trust. And you need to make sure that those are people you really can trust. Tor, onion routing, the story is a little bit more complicated. It was created around 25 years ago by the American military, and it was released to the public because it's very hard to run a network where you hide traffic without lots of users using it. And that also is the network effect, which has prevented alternatives to Tor from coming along. Now, for a long time, Tor was widely considered fairly secure. It always had exploitable drawbacks, but these were considered things that were sort of, the best you could do. Over time, however, intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, and other organizations have gotten better, allegedly, at disrupting and de-anonymizing Tor. The same sorts of things go for secure operating systems. In theory, they're wonderful, but in practice, many of them wind up having flaws that are discovered later, which are going to become public a lot far after things like intelligence agencies have been using them for years. They will often help, but they will only do so much. So one big difference, however, between things as they stood maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we talk about the internet and now is the rise of spyware for hire companies. So groups like the NSO Group, Pandiru, Quadream, Dark Matter. I wonder if perhaps any of the people on this call may have heard of or had to deal with these organizations or the technology they employ. What they essentially are is cyber mercenaries. They're people who, they're organizations which will sell their services to a group of clients, the highest bidder, sometimes groups that the state that they're headquartered in or affiliated with want them to attack. This is a new phenomenon in the last maybe 5 or 10 years. This is a new threat that journalists are having to face, is that there are dedicated companies in the private sector which operate transnationally with a proven track record of being able to get into the physical devices and digital devices of journalists. The most prominent of the, probably the most famous incident involving these is Jamal Khashoggi, who was hacked by the NSO Group, which led to the disclosure of his location and his subsequent murder allegedly by Saudi authorities. But there are many, many examples of this happening all around the world, in the Middle East, in Mexico, in India, and other places. Now, having said all of this and painted this bleak picture, there is some good news. And there are some useful lessons, I think, to take away from this. The first piece of good news that I'll give you is that there are far more alternatives. There are far more encrypted messaging apps. There are far more things that one can use which will provide some layer of security rather than none than there were, for example, when I began my work back in 2015, 2014. Simply none of this stuff existed 10 or 15 years ago, or to the extent that it did, it was in a far less user-friendly format. The second piece of good news, or, well, what appears to be good news to me, is that I looked at the Committee for the Protection of Journalists and the timeline that they have on the number of journalists that have been killed each year, starting in 1992, which is essentially before the internet age. And although it is incredibly sad to see the number of people that have been killed in the line of duty, as the saying goes, the number of people, in absolute terms at least, has fluctuated but has held relatively constant since the early 90s, which probably means that in relative terms it may be declining, because since the early 90s, the number of people who are considered journalists has probably expanded quite a bit with the rise of things like digital media. None of this is to discount the horrible threats that many people are facing in their line of work as journalists, but a little bit of context there. Now, to conclude what I've just said, I'm going to really quickly give people a framework that I think that they should use to think about security threats. The first thing that you need to understand is that if at all possible, avoid using digital devices. The simple fact of the matter is, if you are doing something that is going to be attracting the attention of an intelligence agency, of a powerful government, of a powerful criminal group, things like that, they will simply have far more resources than you to target you, to find you, etc. If at all possible, avoid using a phone, avoid connecting to a cell network, avoid using a computer. If this is not possible, however, which is likely going to be the case in much of your work, use burner devices. Use temporary phones, temporary computers, temporary hard drives, things like this that you can quickly grab from somewhere relatively anonymously, connect to a network, throw away. Because the way that agencies or any group of people that are going to be targeting journalists work is, as soon as they can identify a node on a network, a SIM number, an IP address, an account linked to a person that they're trying to target, they'll immediately go to work, breaking the passwords, looking for exploits, cracking encryption, things like that. If you use burner devices, you give yourself a decaying window of time whereby you have some relative guarantee of security. This will not last, but the more times that you the more times that you switch devices, you switch to a new burner device, the more you reset the clock and the more time you buy yourself. And then aside from that, much of what people are going to need to do to keep them safe is simply old-fashioned operational security. So avoid things like social media, be careful who you talk to, and so forth. I believe that my time is up. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that this was informative.
Thank you very much to you, Thomas Mason. It is important to get pieces of advice and also to have some good news in these difficult times as long as journalist security is concerned. I am now pleased to introduce Ousman Noor. Ousman Noor is the co-founder of the Civilian Agenda. Ousman is a human rights barrister from the United Kingdom. For 3 years, he worked as a government relations manager in Geneva for an international campaign to establish a new treaty against autonomous weapon systems, also known as killer robots. He is now the co-director of the Civilian Agenda, using advocacy and filmmaking to amplify civilian narratives in armed conflicts. So what is the Civilian Agenda? The Civilian Agenda amplifies civilian voices, placing them at the forefront of international discussions on armed conflict. Through harnessing the power of first-hand accounts, investigative reports, and multimedia storytelling, the Civilian Agenda tries to shape public opinion, to influence policy, and drive political change to protect the rights, dignities, and well-being of civilians all around the world. Ousman, thank you for joining us here in the Geneva Press Club today. Ousman, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And can I just start by thanking the previous speaker for reminding us of this alarming reality with this all-pervading surveillance we seem to all be living through, in which we are advised for our own basic privacy, for our own basic protection, to not use our phones, to not use our computers, to not use social media, in a way robbing us of our basic forms of communication and humanity, in fact. It's a very alarming situation, and incredible how we've almost sleptwalked into this. People like Edward Snowden, I recall, telling us, warning us of this potential scenario. It appears that time has arrived. I'm going to talk about repression of journalistic freedom in the context of Gaza, and talk more broadly about the role that journalists have and what effective measures that I think need to be taken to ensure their protection. In the last 12 months, whatever faith was remaining of the international rules-based order has been systematically destroyed. The horror of seeing children burned alive while sheltering in hospitals, rows of corpses sprawled out in bombed-out schools, and the destruction of 70% of all civilian infrastructure in Gaza has brought global awareness of Israel's systematic violations of international law, ranging from prohibitions on collective punishment, starvation as a method of warfare, ethnic cleansing, unlawful occupation, apartheid, and genocide, the crime of all crimes. But it is not just Israel committing these crimes. We've also been aware of the complicity of Western governments that have continued to provide financial, diplomatic, and military support while these crimes are committed. Our awareness of these horrors has not come about because of journalistic freedom, but despite decades of journalistic repression. For generations, Western media narratives have aimed to shape public opinion on the relationship between Israel and Palestine by systematically dehumanizing Palestinian lives. In November 2023, 8 UK-based journalists working for the BBC wrote a letter accusing it of being, quote, guilty of double standards in how civilians are seen, end quote. The letter stated that, quote, the BBC has failed to accurately tell this story through omission and lack of critical engagement with Israel's claims, and it has therefore failed to help the public engage with and understand the human rights abuses unfolding in Gaza, end quote. Just this month, 10 journalists who covered the war on Gaza for 2 of the world's leading news networks, CNN and BBC, revealed the inner workings of those newsrooms from October 7th onwards, alleging pro-Israel bias in coverage, systematic double standards, including prohibitions on using the words genocide and apartheid, and frequent violations of journalistic principles. This effort to dehumanize Palestinians is decades old. Throughout previous bombing campaigns in Gaza, the value of life placed on a Palestinian has always been a fraction of that placed on an Israeli, and the instigators of violence have always been portrayed as Palestinians driven by fundamentalism. These narratives have aimed to obscure the truth and prevent audiences from understanding Israel as a settler colonial state, unlawfully occupying Palestinian land, forcibly relocating indigenous people, and subjecting them to a vast network of checkpoints under the shadow of an apartheid wall. The effort to prevent journalistic coverage has been guided by government policy in the USA and Israel. In 1988, during the First Intifada, when Palestinians organized peaceful protests against the long-standing occupation of their land through boycotts and refusal to work, they were met with a brutal response from the occupying power, including mass arrests, arbitrary detention, and violent repression of those protesting. During this time, a photo emerged of a 17-year-old boy with a stone in his hand, being beaten by 2 Israeli soldiers, with one of them breaking the boy's arm with the back of a rifle. This image appeared in the US press, who were alarmed by the egregious power disparity between the armed soldiers beating this boy into submission and the now popularized depiction of the Palestinians as children with stones versus Israeli soldiers with tanks was born. In January of that year, Henry Kissinger held an audience with leading figures of the Israeli lobby in the United States, and a memorandum of that meeting was leaked. What he says in that meeting is extremely telling, because his chief concern was not that Israel was committing these brutalities, but frustration at the fact that it had been revealed. He urges Israeli leaders to, quote, throw out the press and ban television from the trouble spots a la South Africa, referring to the repression of journalistic freedom under the apartheid South African regime in the 1980s. And he also suggests that the Israeli army should be sent to put down the insurrection, quote, overwhelmingly, brutally, and rapidly, end quote. So in the face of peaceful resistance from Palestinian people during the First Intifada, seeking to achieve their right to self-determination and live free from unlawful occupation, the response was to ensure that the press don't cover the story and be ready to shoot those involved. In 2022, this is what they did to Shireen Abu Akleh. While reporting on an Israeli military raid in the West Bank of city of Jenin, Shireen was shot and killed by an Israeli sniper. She was a Palestinian-American journalist who worked for Al Jazeera for over 25 years and was a deeply respected voice in the struggles faced by Palestinians. Despite wearing a press vest and helmet, clearly identifying her as a journalist, eyewitnesses and multiple investigations, including one by the United Nations, indicated that she was shot by Israeli forces. This targeting and killing of journalists and reporting on the atrocities committed by Israel has been a hallmark of the current genocide. In the last year, there have been over 130 journalists killed, the highest number in any modern conflict, with Israel preventing reporters from entering Gaza and even closing down entire TV stations in Israel and the occupied West Bank. Why is Israel doing this? Jonathan Dager, head of the Reporters Without Borders Middle East desk, explained, if there are no journalists, there's no one who can independently verify and tell the world that then the Israeli army becomes the source of information, end quote. The goal is to remove the storytellers and deny the truth. This repression of journalism is not limited to those reporting from the ground, but also to those reporting from around the world. Over the last few months, the UK government has been engaging in alarming and intensified levels of repression against activists, including artists, journalists, and academics. To give a few examples, on the morning of the 16th of October, counter-terrorism police in Glasgow Airport detained journalist, whistleblower, human rights campaigner, and former British diplomat Craig Murray upon his return from Iceland. In August 2024, freelance journalist Richard Medhurst was detained and questioned by police at Heathrow Airport. Medhurst said he believed he was targeted for speaking out on the situation in Palestine, and in fact spoke at the UN here in Geneva recently about the detention. Just a few weeks later, another journalist and activist, Sarah Wilkinson, saw her home raided in the early hours of the morning. Personal items were confiscated, but to date, she has not been charged. This week, 10 counter-terrorism police officers raided the London home of the prominent journalist Asa Winstanley, who eventually was neither arrested nor charged with any offence, but his electronic devices were confiscated by the police. And this month, the General Secretaries of the UK's National Union of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists wrote to the head of counter-terrorism policing in the UK to raise concerns about the use of counter-terrorism powers against journalists covering Gaza. So while Israel kills journalists reporting on the ground in Gaza, Western governments silence, repress, and criminalize those reporting on this reality. This repression is part of a strategy and silencing dissent to hide the ongoing slaughter in Gaza and now Lebanon from public view. Yet this intimidation has not diminished the courage of journalists in Palestine and around the world from reporting the truth. While Israel is committed to preventing accountability for their actions, fearless journalism has ensured that reality is exposed. The coverage has not only informed the public, but also the UN and international legal mechanisms to hold the perpetrators to account. Israel is being investigated for genocide at the ICJ, and at the initial hearing in February, the legal teams were able to rely on detailed reports and footage of violations by journalists to demonstrate the commission of genocide at the ICJ. In the investigation conducted by the International Criminal Court, the UN Commission of Inquiry submitted 7,000 pieces of evidence collected by journalists to show evidence of war crimes, including extermination of a civilian population. Due to this work, it has been established by the highest court in the world that Israel is an unlawful occupying power committing apartheid, and the UN General Assembly has voted to end arms trade and demand the evacuation of Israelis from occupied Palestinian territory. The title of my talk here is on effective measures to counter the repression of journalists. My answer to this is to keep on telling the truth. Do not be intimidated or silenced using the words apartheid or genocide, and be clear that Israel is conducting extermination of the Palestinian people. You may face intimidation in doing so, but your voice is needed to protect the lives and legacies of all those journalists who have already been killed for telling us the truth. The reality is that the years of repression of accurate reporting on Palestine is finally crumbling. As Arundhati Roy said, the winner of the Booker Prize, no propaganda on earth can hide the wound that is Palestine. We have all been witness to the horror, and unless we speak out, our silence becomes complicity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ousman Noor, for this important contribution on behalf of the civilian agenda. I am now pleased to introduce Laura Burns. Laura Burns is an accomplished investigative journalist with over 15 years of experience, specializing in covering global crime, conflict, terrorism, and human rights abuses. She spent much of her career at BBC Panorama, where she produced documentaries on issues such as organ and sex trafficking, global terrorism, and non-state actors in conflict zone. Laura has a deep understanding of legal, ethical, and editorial standards. She has managed investigations under intense pressure, making critical decisions that shape global narratives. Laura also holds an executive master's in humanitarian law and human rights, thus enhancing her ability to tackle issues related to conflict and justice. Laura, thank you for joining us today from Belfast, here in Geneva, and I'm happy to give you the floor to tell us about the importance of supporting local journalism, as well as the difficulties in securing accurate sources in conflicts where one party is a state, and of course, some lessons from Northern Ireland too. So thank you, Laura, again for joining us today, and I'm glad to give you the floor.
Hi, thank you so much, Isabelle. Thanks to all of my fellow panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, a good variety of perspectives and really important points being made. and it's my pleasure to be here. I will speak just a little bit about me and about my career as an international journalist. Largely, I produce content for UK audience, and there's some difficulties with that restriction that I'll go into. But I really want to reinforce the absolute importance of supporting the work of local journalists for international audiences. It really is a collaborative industry. So I've been producing documentaries for over 10 years, all for the BBC. Was with the BBC for 16 years in total before going freelance last year. And during my career, I developed an interest in international crime and conflict-related stories, especially in the Middle East. And I love my job. I love making documentaries, and I love that I get to speak to people and conduct research into areas that most people just never get access to. I am always welcomed into people's homes, usually for them to speak about the most difficult thing that has ever happened to them in their lives. And their only motivation to speak to me is justice, whatever justice means to them. That's most people's motivation to speak to journalists. And I've interviewed soldiers, combatants, commanders, politicians, diplomats, humanitarians, and I really believe that most people believe that they are good people. Most people go to sleep at night believing that they're a good person. And in times of conflict, since I was a child, what I've always found fascinating and really interesting is how two combatants on opposing sides of a conflict can both go to sleep with that same belief. How do you both believe the same thing about yourself? Your versions of truth and reality and justice are so different. Why and how? And this is where journalism comes in, and in particular documentary journalism, I think, where you can really get to understand people. Now, because I make documentaries, when I cover conflict, it's usually after the conflict has ended. As a UK-based journalist, my remit is always going to be gathering stories and producing films for a UK audience first. So that obviously limits a lot of important conflict-related stories that get told to an international audiences. The story obviously then needs to kind of appeal to a UK audience. It needs to have some sort of connection with the UK audience. It needs to align with a number of political objectives and so on, which is the first kind of hurdle. But when we do make stories for a UK audience about international conflict, it's local journalists that do the groundwork. We are entirely reliant on the primary work of local journalists. We lean on their expert knowledge, on their contacts for the story, and for our safety on the ground. I have always had really, really high levels of support when it comes to entering kind of conflict zones or anywhere that is high risk or dangerous. But my biggest privilege is that I get to leave. I go in, our team gets to decide how far we push the story. We can say no if nobody feels safe. We have the privilege of taking every risk when it comes to reporting conflict in an assessed way as a team together. For local journalists, particularly in Gaza at this moment in time, they don't have any of that privilege. They don't have the choice. They're living through it, whether they document it or not. And so they must document it, and they need our support to help them to document that. From my experiences and some of the stories that I have worked on, I'm not going to go into massive details about individual stories, but one of the issues that kind of arises again and again, and everyone will be familiar with this from recent coverage, is securing accurate sources, especially when one side is a state. When it comes to kind of daily news and daily newsrooms, this is very difficult to counter when there is one authoritative, straightforward version of military activity. States obviously never have to reveal the security intelligence, their assessments as to why a military action will lead to their military advantage. That's the assessment that they get to make in private. We see the play out of that military action and the the obvious human suffering from those things. There's very little mechanism to assess the internal decisions about what intelligence or what mistaken intelligence might lead to those military actions. We obviously see there's bodies and mechanisms to assess whether the outcome, the actual military objective is in line with the Geneva Conventions, but where this is reliant upon inaccurate, factual or fabricated information, there is very little way to interrogate those internal decisions. Obviously, no state is ever going to bear open their whole security intelligence apparatus, but it is useful to have some form of transparency or some form of international expectation that when military actions are taken on false premises or with false or inaccurate information, that there's some transparency about the mistakes, that there is some interrogation of why, rather than repeating statements. For example, statements as to where are military targets hidden in hospitals, are military targets hidden in civilian infrastructure, and so on. When it comes to daily news, this is obviously a huge problem. You can see these press releases, this is what turns into headlines, and this is how the story is told on a running kind of basis. When it comes to longer form documentaries, it's still an issue because international teams going into that state are reliant on the state for permission to access the country and cover the activities of that state. So journalists are in a vulnerable position all around, where one party to the conflict is a state. The only solution to this is witness testimony. The real story of every conflict is on the ground. It's what happens to the families, it's what happens to children, it's what happens to families' livelihoods, grandparents, the history, the future, the blood, sweat, and tears of the population. That is the story of every conflict, and it can't be told without local journalists on the ground. It is essential to provide a balance for state press releases with the gathering of accounts by local journalists, their stories, and they need help to store their rushes, store their materials, and to protect the evidence. We've seen in the use of in Ukraine war and in the UN mechanism, the value of gathering source material by local journalists. This becomes a repository of war crimes, and this needs to be protected. There's an additional difficulty, obviously, at this moment in time, where, particularly in this environment of fake news, some people might remember way back in 2016, Trump at his rallies really set the tone for much of the rest of the decade when he said, "The journalists are disgusting." I don't know if anybody here remembers that, but what has followed is an absolute undermining of truth and a devaluing of first-hand accounts. Nowhere is this more important to be protected than in conflicts. Journalists are a pillar of our democracy. They're the eyes and ears of a population. They are the defenders of public interest, regardless of politics or finance or power. They're observers. Increasingly, outlets are spending millions of pounds and increasing numbers of staff just trying to verify social media reports. With AI, it's going to become an insurmountable problem. The people that are going to be affected by this are civilians in conflict zones. So this is a significant recent area in conflict reporting that I feel we need to address and as a community find solutions for. We can't allow valuable evidence collected under conflict to be undermined. This is the account of crimes. This is the account of the destruction of families. I don't know the solution for that. There's people on this board with much more experience than me to just open a discussion about what that solution might be. But some sort of repository of information and evidence accessible by journalists and humanitarians, which becomes an accurate record of that conflict or of that war, which is maintained independently and with integrity, would be invaluable to the work that journalists like Mohamed are doing on the ground in Gaza, for example. And just to bring a little of my background and my Northern Irish history to you, I grew up in a conflict, so it wasn't a war. It never reached the intensity to trigger IHL, but it did secure huge international effort to bring about peace, and has become a little microcosm on how kind of conflict can move into some sort of peace. And the collection and maintenance of evidence has been one of a particularly important lesson to learn. War is dirty. War is an abnormal situation for any human to live in. And peace, getting to peace, is like putting a plaster over your wound and ripping it off and scratching it every so often and setting back healing for another few years. It's also really messy. But one thing that I have seen throughout my childhood and my adulthood was the importance of local journalism. Until we had local journalists in Northern Ireland reporting what exactly the conflict was like, we only had British journalists coming from London to inform us about what was happening outside our front door. As I grew older, there emerged a generation of local journalists who grew up and they spoke to combatants, and they coloured in the picture that I recognised when I looked outside, or when I heard my parents talking, or when I walked to school and saw what was happening outside. And these new journalists articulated and reflected the paradox that had always interested me about conflict. They spoke to people and they explained how two combatants go to bed with both believing that they're very good people, with both very different perspectives on exactly the same plot of land. It reinforced to me the need for diversity in journalism, the need for commissioning of stories, the need for diversity, not only in journalism and in journalists, but in the commissioning of stories. We need to be commissioning stories that appeal to wider audiences. And in the executive levels of journalism, we need diversity of opinion, diversity of background. I am really proud to work alongside some of the journalists whose work I'm describing at this point in time. I work alongside them now and have even produced some of them. And after 30 years of peace, we are still grappling in Northern Ireland with allegations and investigations of conflict-related crimes committed here. The sources and the networks and the evidence that these local journalists gathered 30, 40 years ago is laying a really important foundation for a public and political appetite for accountability in conflict-related crimes that were committed here. They uncovered evidence and they protected that evidence for over 30 years. And through doing that, they've given respect to the stories of the blood, sweat, and tears that this conflict has created. So I just wanted to kind of widen out. Obviously, gathering information is a really significant part of journalism, but it goes way beyond that. We can hold bad decisions to account. We can hold inaccurate military decisions to account. We can secure justice for families and civilians who have suffered, but also can secure the ground for new political ambitions. So I know in this time, there's really, really low trust in everything. There's really low trust in journalism, in the political structure, in the international legal structure, in diplomacy, and in general, really low hope in humanity. It has shown us recently how weak our systems have become, but I do think that we need to invest in them. We need to support local journalists, and we need to work within the systems that we have and understand the value of it and fight for them, because everybody's freedom and everybody's democracy depends on that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura Barnes, for this smart, sensitive account and testimony, and your reminder of the importance of local journalism within a conflict. I am now glad to give back the floor to Mohamed Al-Hammadi, the president of Jusoor International, himself a journalist, for case studies and real-life experiences. Mohamed, please join me. So, Mohamed, you will talk about your own experience in the Middle East and North Africa, the lessons you learned and the protective measures that have proven effective for journalist reporting in active war zones. Mohamed, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vice. Allow me, I will speak in Arabic. I hope you can use the translations. في البداية شكرا جزيلا أشكر جميع الحاضرين وأشكر حقيقة المتحدثين الذين سبقوني في هذه الكلمات المبدعة والخلاقة حقيقة، والتي ربما تسهل من مهمتي في هذه الورقة. نتكلم اليوم عن موضوع ربما نستشعر بأهميته، نستشعر بخصوصيته. ربما موضوع يبدو في بعض الأحيان أنه يتم التجنب الحديث فيه، لكن أعتقد اليوم ليس في منطقتنا في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا فقط، وإنما في العالم بأسره الصحفيين يواجهون التحديات الكثيرة حقيقة. ربما على مدار أكثر من 60 عام كثير من القوانين، القرارات صدرت من الأمم المتحدة، من المنظمات المختلفة للأمم المتحدة، قرارات تدعو إلى حماية الصحفيين، إلى عدم الاعتداء عليهم، إلى خلق المناخ المناسب لعملهم. لكن إلى اليوم نجد أن هذه التحديات ما زالت مستمرة، وحتى مسألة حماية الصحفيين هي جزء من خطة التنمية المستدامة للأمم المتحدة، والمكاتب المختلفة التابعة للأمم المتحدة تعمل على هذا الأساس. لكن للأسف الشديد كل هذه الجهود وجهود اليونسكو وما شابه ذلك، كل هذه القرارات للأسف لا تطبق على أرض الواقع. نجد هناك التفاف كبير، تحايل كثير، والصحفيين لا يزالون يدفعون الثمن الباهظ في أثناء أدائهم لعملهم في الميدان. حقيقة ربما أشكال التعدي على الصحفيين مختلفة ومتنوعة، يعني تبدأ من إرهابهم وتخويفهم جسديا، تصفيتهم جسديا، تهديدهم في أسرهم، تهديدهم في وظائفهم، وما يتبع ذلك حقيقة كذلك من تبعات نفسية كبيرة وعميقة على الصحفيين. ووجدنا هذا الأمر ربما أدى إلى انسحاب الكثير من الصحفيين واختيارهم الابتعاد عن هذه المهنة في أوقات الحروب والصراعات. حقيقة المسألة الأخطر التي أصبحنا نشاهدها في السنوات الأخيرة هو الاستهداف المتعمد للصحفيين. وربما هنا الواقع والظرف الحالي يفرض علينا أن نتكلم على موضوع غزة، لأن ما يحدث في غزة حقيقة منذ عام أمر يفوق الخيال، يفوق توقع أي إنسان فيما يتعلق بالصحفيين الذين كانوا فعليا في كثير من الأوقات مستهدفين، وكأن المسألة كانت قرار بتصفيتهم وإعدامهم فقط لأنهم كانوا يعملون على إيصال الحقيقة إلى العالم. الحقيقة الأخرى ربما التحدي الآخر الذي يواجه الصحفيين في مناطق النزاع مسألة سهولة الانتقال والتحرك. دائما في وقت الصراعات هناك تحجيم وتحديد مهام الصحفيين ومواقع عملهم، وبالتالي نجد أن الصحفيين يبقون ربما في بعض المواقع لساعات طويلة ينتظرون كي يصلوا إلى موقع الحدث دون أن يحدث ذلك. في أحداث غزة رأينا أن الأمر في هذا الأمر كان أكثر وضوحا، حيث أن هذا الأمر لم يقتصر على الصحفيين المحليين الموجودين داخل غزة أو داخل فلسطين، وإنما حتى الصحفيين الدوليين لم يتمكنوا من الدخول ونقل الواقع في لبنان. ربما يعني القصص كثيرة حقيقة، وفي غزة كذلك. ربما القصص التي سنرويها أو التي يعرفها الجميع كثيرة جدا حقيقة. في لبنان مؤخرا وما يحدث اليوم نستطيع أن نقول أن الحوادث التي شهدتها لبنان لم تتوقف أبدا. وفي الأحداث الأخيرة بعد أحداث 7 أكتوبر بأسبوع أو أسبوعين تم استهداف صحفيين في لبنان عندما بدأ حزب الله بمهاجمة إسرائيل، فمباشرة تم قصف الصحفيين وقتل منهم صحفيين وبعد ذلك صحفيين آخرين. في لبنان كذلك لم يسلم الصحفيين حتى من إبداء رأيهم. وقضية الزميل الصحفي سليم لقمان لغاية اليوم معروفة. سليم قتل في عام 2021 في حادث سيارة تم إطلاق الرصاص عليه فقط لأنه كان يرفض أن يدعم حزب الله وكان مناوئا لأفكار ولعمليات حزب الله، وبالتالي كان القرار بتصفيته رغم أنه من نفس الطائفة. ولكن هذا الأمر يبين أن الصحفي لا ينظر لا إلى دينه لا إلى طائفته لا إلى جنسه، مجرد أن تكون صحفي فأنت هدف لمن لا يريد أن يتعامل معك. اليمن ليس بعيدة حقيقة عن التحديات التي واجهها الصحفيين. الصحفية اليمنية رشا عبد الله نعرفها جميعا في 2021 كذلك تم اغتيالها في حادث تفجير سيارة. كانت ذاهبة مع زوجها في الصباح إلى المستشفى كي تضع مولودها هناك، والحادث أتى من الحوثيين لتصفيتها، لأنها كذلك كانت تنشر القصص وتنقل الواقع هي وزوجها. زوجها نجا في الحادث ولكن هي قتلت وجنينها طبعا في نفس الوقت. فلسطين ربما الحديث عنها يطول، وما يحدث في غزة ربما شاهد على بشاعة الجرائم ضد الصحفيين. منذ 7 أكتوبر إلى اليوم أكثر من 130 صحفي الذين تم التسجيل أنهم قتلوا، غير عشرات وربما مئات المصابين من الصحفيين. ربما القصة المثيرة حقيقة في مسألة الصحفيين في فلسطين قصة وائل الدحدوح، هذا الصحفي الذي ظل حتى آخر لحظة يقاوم ويفقد أسرته الواحد تلو الآخر بتعمد كذلك. نحن لا نستطيع أن نرى قصة وائل الدحدوح ونعتبر أنها قصة جاءت تصفية أسرته بهذه المصادفة. خسر ربما أغلب أبنائه، أسرته، زوجته. لماذا؟ لأنه كان ينقل الصورة، يعمل في الميدان، واليوم هو يتعالج، ويعني ربما يتعالج من إصابته الجسدية، لكن إصابته النفسية كيف يتم معالجتها بعد ما خسر عائلته بأسرها. طبعا في فلسطين لا أستطيع أن أقفز على قصة شيرين أبو عاقلة التي ذكرها الأستاذ عثمان. شيرين أبو عاقلة تم استهدافها كذلك بشكل مباشر، رصاصة في الرأس، رغم أنها كانت ترتدي السترة الواقية من الرصاص، رغم أنها اتخذت كل الاحتياطات كي تحمي نفسها هي وزملائها، لكن كانت الرصاصة موجهة إليها. واليوم نجد أن شيرين أبو عاقلة رغم يعني وضوح جريمتها إلا أن شيئا لم يحدث. وعلى العكس ربما إسرائيل لأكثر من مرة وعلى لسان وزير الدفاع أعلن أنه لن يتعاون في مسألة التحقيقات الجارية في مسألة مقتل شيرين أبو عاقلة. وهذا الأمر يعكس حقيقة عقلية من يتعامل مع الصحفيين سواء في إسرائيل أو في غيرها، ويؤكد أن الصحفيين ما يزالون في وضع خطير. طبعا ما يحدث في أوكرانيا كذلك، يمكن 15 صحفي الذين قتلوا خلال هذه الحرب، والأمر مستمر للأسف الشديد. ولا يمكن أن نقول أن حال الصحفيين يتحسن أو في تحسن، على العكس الواقع يزداد سوءا. وهنا ربما نأتي إلى موضوعنا في موضوع حماية الصحفيين. كيف يمكن أن نحمي الصحفيين؟ أو السؤال، هل يمكن أن نحمي الصحفيين؟ الزميل جان فيليب تكلم في البداية، وهو من منظمة شهيرة، منظمة بريس. هذه المنظمة التي نجحت على مدار 20 عام حقيقة أن تحمي الصحفيين من خلال السترة الواقية، السترة الزرقاء، التي يفترض أنها مجرد أن يراها أي حامل سلاح أن يتفادى هذه السترة وأن يبتعد عنها. ورغم الجهود حقيقة الكبيرة التي نقدرها لهذه المنظمة، وهي إلى اليوم حقيقة تبذل وتقوم بأعمال جليلة لحماية الصحفيين، إلا أننا نرى أن اليوم هذا الشعار تحول من أنه كان أقوى يعني درع واقي من الرصاص إلى أن أصبح المغناطيس الذي يجذب الرصاص. للأسف الشديد في مواقع النزاعات أصبحوا يبحثون عن الصحفيين، يبحثون عن من يرتدي هذه السترة كي يستهدفوه. واستهداف الصحفيين في النهاية نحن نقول دائما هو استهداف للحقيقة حتى لا تنقل الصورة. وربما الزميل محمد الصواف من فلسطين في الفيديو الذي تكلم عنه قبل قليل أشار إلى هذا الأمر، أشار إلى أن الصحفيين أصبحوا يخافون أن يرتدوا ما يشير إلى أنهم صحفيين، لأنهم يعرفون أنهم بمجرد أن يرتدوا هذه الشعارات سيستهدفون. ولكن هذا الأمر طبعا لا يعني أن لا يرتدي الصحفي وأن لا يحمي نفسه، بالعكس يجب أن يرتدي هذه السترة وأن يحمي نفسه قدر الإمكان. المسألة ربما المهمة قبل أن أنتقل إلى التوصيات في هذا المحور، والذي أعتقد حقيقة أنه السبب الرئيسي في استمرار هذه الاستهدافات والتجرؤ أكثر وأكثر في استهداف الصحفيين، هو إفلات المجرمين الذين يستهدفون الصحفيين من العقاب. مسألة إفلاتهم من العقاب تجعلهم يتمادون ويستمرون. وإذا أردنا أن نحمي الصحفيين، أنا أعتقد النقطة الأولى والخطوة الأولى والمنطلق الأول هو تفعيل القرارات والقوانين التي تجرم عملية استهداف الصحفيين، وأن لا يفلت كل من يستهدف الصحفيين من العقاب. وهذا الأمر للأسف الشديد على الرغم من الجهود الكبيرة المبذولة في هذا الأمر، إلا أننا لم نرى إلى اليوم أي محاسبة لمن استهدف الصحفيين وقتل الصحفيين. وربما ذكرنا أبرز مثال وأكثر مثال صارخ ربما هي شيرين أبو عقلة، فلسطينية أمريكية، وغير قادرين أن نوصل صوتها وأن نأخذ حقها وهي في قبرها. وبالتالي أعتقد على المنظمات الدولية، على الأمم المتحدة، على كل من يعمل حقيقة ويستهدف حماية الصحفيين، نقول نحن لسنا بحاجة إلى قرارات إضافية، لسنا إلى قوانين، لسنا بحاجة إلى دعوات، لسنا بحاجة إلى خطابات، نحن بحاجة إلى أن نفعل القوانين وأن نحاسب من ارتكبوا تلك الجرائم في حق الصحفيين. أخيراً ربما قد يكون من المهم أن نتكلم عن بعض التوصيات التي قد تساعد في حماية الصحفيين. طبعاً نحن نعرف أن هناك توصيات تقليدية كثيرة توجه للصحفيين في مناطق النزاع، دعوتهم إلى مثل ما ذكرنا إلى ارتداء السترة الواقية، التعريف بأنفسهم، الاختباء في مواقع تحميهم، عدم الظهور في المواقع التي قد يستهدفون فيها، عدم التواجد في بين المدنيين أو ما شابه ذلك. كل هذه الأمور حقيقة يفعلها الصحفيين، ورغم ذلك فهم يقتلون ويقتلون بالعشرات. إذن ربما أنطلق مما ذكره زميلنا توماس في كلمته، وهو المتخصص في التكنولوجيا، وربما نحن بحاجة أن نفكر قليلا خارج الصندوق في التوصيات التي نتمنى أن تحظى باهتمام حقيقة. وكذلك أتمنى أن تتبنى من نادي الصحافة في جنيف وكل المنظمات المهتمة. سوف نخرج خارج الصندوق ونقول اليوم نحن بحاجة أن نفكر في الذكاء الاصطناعي، بما أن لدينا أداة قوية قد تساعد على حماية الصحفيين. هذه الأداة ربما تساعد كثيرا في بداية الأمر أن تحدد لنا المخاطر المتوقعة، وبالتالي نستطيع أن نجعل الصحفيين في مأمن من أي خطر ممكن. تحليل الوضع ووضع الاحتمالات أمر مهم جدا حقيقة قبل أن يتحرك الصحفيين. أعتقد حقيقة من المهم كذلك أن يتم استخدام الدرونز كذلك في مناطق الحروب والنزاعات وخصوصا المواقع الملتهبة. نحن ندرك حقيقة أن حماس الصحفيين ورغبتهم في نقل الحقيقة تدخلهم في المناطق الخطرة وتحت خط النار كما نقول، لكن أنا أعتقد استخدام التكنولوجيا اليوم أصبح مهما وأصبح ممكنا حتى نستطيع أن نحمي الصحفيين من الموت المحقق. تدريب الصحفيين، طبعا نحن ندرب الصحفيين في السابق على مسألة كيف أنهم يحمون نفسهم قبل أن ينتقلوا إلى مواقع الخطر، لكن أنا أعتقد من المهم تدريبهم على الأمن السيبراني. كما ذكر فيليبس ربما اليوم أصبحت الهواتف تسهل كثيرا حقيقة من استهداف الصحفيين، ورأينا كثير من الصحفيين الذين استهدفوا، وأحداهم الصحفية الأمريكية في سوريا سنة 2012 عندما تمت مراقبة هاتفها وبالتالي تم استهدافها. فبالتالي توعية الصحفيين في الأمن السيبراني أعتقد أصبح مهم جدا في المرحلة المقبلة حتى يتم حمايتهم قدر الإمكان. النقطة ربما الأخيرة كذلك أن نعتمد على مسألة الصحافة الافتراضية، الصحافة التي تساعد الصحفيين، وهذا الأمر بحاجة إلى تطوير، إلى عمل كبير ربما من التقنيين. كيف نستطيع أن نخلق الصحفي الذي يكون افتراضيا موجود في أرض المعركة ويستطيع أن ينقل الصورة ويستطيع أن ينقل الحقيقة. وأعتقد اليوم ربما التكنولوجيا تساعد كثيرا وقد تسهم أكثر وأكثر في حماية الصحفيين وتقليل عدد الضحايا منهم. فبالتالي أعتقد اليوم هذه دعوة إلى استخدام الذكاء الاصطناعي في مسألة حماية الصحفيين. الموضوع حقيقة طويل والموضوع متشعب، وأنا حقيقة بلا شك استفدت كثيرا من مداخلات الزملاء، وهناك بعض الأفكار تم ذكرها حقيقة، وربما نفتح المجال للأسئلة. وفي ختام الكلمة حقيقة أكرر شكري لنادي الصحافة في جنيف على دعمهم، على استضافتهم لهذه الجلسة، وعلى دورهم الدائم والمستمر في حماية الصحفيين ودعم الصحفيين، وشكرا جزيلا لكم.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oh, please stay with me. Please stay with me. We are now opening a Q&A session, both online and, of course, live, English or Arabic. So, I have a microphone. So, who would start here in the room for any comments or questions, both to Mr. Mohamed Al-Hammadi or to one of our speakers? Please just raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for these very interesting interventions and for organizing this event. As I was listening to the interventions and hearing about the risks and the sacrifices that journalists are faced with in conflict zones, one of the things that came to my mind is that I find shocking is the lack of solidarity often with these journalists by their colleagues in many Western countries. For example, in mainstream Western media, where there is very often very few reports of the killing of these journalists, the brutal way in which their families are targeted, the torture that they face. And often these reports seem to be censored. And you would think that journalists would stand more in solidarity with other journalists on the ground who are taking such risks to report the truth. So I just wonder also how journalists can be protected, not only by protecting them physically and making sure that the laws of international law are implemented when it comes to their protection, but also protecting their message, making sure that the risks that they're taking are at least valued in the sense that the messages they're trying to spread from the ground, the footage they're taking is not censored in the West, but rather valued and shared. Whereas we're very often seeing that there's a suppression of information coming from these journalists. So just wondering what your thoughts are about that. Thank you.
Who would you like you to answer your questions? Mr. Hammadi, maybe? Or maybe online? Did you get the question? And is someone willing to answer the question? Maybe the first one? The question of the lack of solidarity between journalists themselves. Okay, so Mr. Hammadi first.
شكرا جزيلا. حقيقة هذا سؤال مهم جدا، وأنا أعتقد هذه واحدة من التحديات الخطيرة والكبيرة التي يعني يعاني منها حقيقة الصحفيون، وننادي فيها في كل اجتماعاتنا كصحفيين. التضامن ربما موجود بين الصحفيين كأفراد، وكذلك بعض المنظمات الصحفية التي تعمل الحقيقة في هذا الإطار، لكن هناك الفعل الأكبر حقيقة المفقود من ناحية المؤسسات الدولية التي تعمل، يفترض أنها تعمل على حماية الصحفيين. نحن نجد اليوم القرارات، ونجد الإدانات، ونجد كل شيء يعني خلينا نقول شفوي يحدث، لكن أين الأكشن وأين الفعل؟ وكما ذكرت حقيقة اليوم لدينا مثل عربي يقول: من أمن العقوبة أساء الأدب، بما معنى إذا من ارتكب الجريمة وهو يعرف أنه لن يحاسب، فبالتالي سيستمر في العقوبة. وهنا نؤكد على مسألة عدم الإفلات من العقاب، ونطالب حقيقة بضرورة وأهمية هذا العمل. طبعا هذه الخطوة لن يمكن تحقيقها إلا من خلال المؤسسات الدولية، وكذلك من الدول الداعمة والتي تتكلم دائما على مسألة حرية الرأي والتعبير والديمقراطية وحقوق الصحفيين. هذه الدول عليها مسؤولية أخلاقية كبيرة بأن تتحرك وأن تقدم خطوات عملية لحماية الصحفيين.
Maybe I turn myself to Laura. Laura, did you get the questions? I would be interested in hearing you answer, as long as lack of solidarity is concerned, and maybe also protecting the message, how to value and share the message.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think there's two layers to your question there. There's solidarity between individual journalists, and I know that there is massive solidarity for, you know, the conflicts that are ongoing at the moment and the journalists that are reporting from individual journalists. The second layer of that is the mainstream organisations and whether they include injustices against journalists in their reporting, in their stories. There's always some sort of rivalry in journalism. There's always vying for stories and so on. But in conflict, there's no need for rivalry. There needs to be solidarity. I couldn't agree with you more. In terms of how we can do that, I think it's membership of international organizations, membership of some of the NGOs and things that are part of this on this panel today, so that journalists are more in contact with their with counterparts in conflict zones and understand a bit more about their experience. Wider membership of things like, you know, Committee to Protect Journalists and so on, and knowing about what's going on. I sort of briefly mentioned it, but I think that there is need for some sort of internationally held repository for the rushes and material that journalists on the ground are gathering to ensure that the integrity of that material and the stories that are being gathered on the ground is protected and is respected exactly as you describe, and that those stories can continue to be told internationally now and in the future. Whereas currently a lot of this material is kind of going online and it is open to a lot of criticism, even though it, once it's posted on Twitter, a video of some of the horrific scenes that we have seen over the last few weeks alone is open to criticism of, in terms of whether it can be verified or not. So that's a potential solution. That obviously takes a lot of investment and support, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's absolutely essential that journalists and journalistic outlets have solidarity with journalists on the ground in conflict.
Thank you. We got a question. Thank you. We got a question to Thomas Mason. We have a question for Thomas Mason. Thomas, are there ways for journalists to effectively hide the existence of information in their possession? If a journalist carries information in a conflict zone and the possession of this information could harm them, how can they protect themselves? Is there any technology available that gives them plausible deniability? Thomas, what kind of answer would you have to these questions from Thesven online?
By all means, as with a theme that's going to run through the responses that I give to these sorts of questions is that there really isn't a simple and straightforward answer. It's going to be extremely contextual. And it's going to depend a lot on what kind of environment you're in. So if you're in an environment, for example, where you have to go through checkpoints, where you have to get searched, things like that, it's obviously going to be extremely difficult to, where digital devices of yours, laptops, phones, things like that might be seized and scanned. It's going to be very difficult, but not impossible, to hide data like that. So if you're talking about, for example, exfiltrating a data set that, some piece of confidential information or something like that you were given by a source, you need to smuggle it out of a certain area. You can always, there is a variety of techniques. It's a little bit too complicated to go into right here, but what's called steganography is a very vibrant field of cryptography and information security, which basically deals with invisible ink type solutions to things. So basically hiding data inside of a large audio file, hiding data inside of a large video file, things like that. If you're going to just sort of be casually inspected by police or something like that, who aren't necessarily going to know how to extract the signal buried inside of a file like that, then that can usually be a good option. It can run the gamut anywhere from just pulling something and putting it on like a small SD drive or something and then trying to hide that inside, your shoe or the seat of your car or something like that. But if you're trying to get data out of an area and you can just use a network to do that, that's also a perfectly valid option. So there are a variety of techniques that people would use in a case like that, and it's really just going to depend on what you anticipate running into, what problems you anticipate running into. That's more than anything going to determine what you should do. If that answers your question, I'd be happy to leave it there, but if not, then I'd be happy to give it another go.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Do we have another questions here, another question or comment here in the room? Yes, you just wait for the microphone. You have the floor.
أحمد المسلماني كاتب مصري وفي مركز جسور. سؤالي يتعلق بأنه دايما فيه بعدين لهذا الأمر. بعد يتعلق بالصحفي أو المراسل اللي موجود في مكان الحرب. والجزء الثاني يتعلق بنشر أو بث المواد التي تأتي من هذا المكان. المساحة التي كانت موجودة من المعلومات في حرب غزة على سبيل المثال، ورغم القتل الصحفيين ورغم قتل عائلاتهم، كانت هناك مساحة كبيرة من المعلومات والصور. لم تقم الصحف العالمية بالنشر بشكل كافي. الصحف الغربية لم تنشر، محطات التلفزيون الغربية لم تنشر، وبالتالي هنا ألف وباء. ألف يتعلق بالمراسل والصحفي على الأرض الذي يتعرض للموت، ومع ذلك استطاع صحفيون ومراسلون كثيرون أن يرسلوا، كما استطاعت تطبيقات تويتر إكس أكثر حرية في هذا الأمر من فيسبوك، تيك توك أكثر حركة من تطبيقات أخرى. وبالتالي ما كان متاحا على تطبيقات ومتاح من الصحفيين قبل قتلهم ومتاح من الصحفيين الذين لم يقتلوا كان كافيا. ومن ثم هل يمكن أن نعمل على باء أيضا، أن نخاطب رؤساء تحرير الصحف الكبرى، رؤساء محطة التلفزيون الكبرى، بأن ما هو متوفر لا ينبغي قمعه حتى لا يكون الضرر مرتين، مرة في عدم السماح للصحفيين ومرة أخرى بعدم نشر ما يأتي به الصحفيون. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on this? Mr. Mohamed, please, you have the floor.
نعم، شكرا أستاذ أحمد. هذا سؤال حقيقة مهم جدا. نحن نتكلم اليوم أن هناك أكثر من طرف في هذا الوضع الذي نعاني منه. أعتقد اليوم ربما هذا ما يجب أن يكون. هناك صحفي يدفع الثمن، يحاول أن يبذل كل ما بوسعه، ولكن أعتقد في المقابل يجب أن يكون هناك دعم كبير جدا جدا. نحن نجد للأسف الشديد أن المؤسسات الإعلامية سواء في منطقتنا أو للأسف حتى في الغرب لا تركز كثيرا على معاناة الصحفيين أو على خسائر الصحفيين، تركز على الخبر، تركز على الحدث. ربما يتم أخذ للأسف الشديد أقول هذا الأمر مقتل الصحفيين كأرقام. اليوم قتل 10 وغدا قتل 20 وبعد ذلك 130 وما شابه من هذه الأرقام، ويتحول الصحفي للأسف الشديد إلى مجرد رقم. هذا الأمر أعتقد يحتاج إلى العمل وربما التضامن الذي تكلمنا عنه في السؤال السابق، أن على المؤسسات الصحفية الإعلامية في العالم بأسرة وربما في الغرب بشكل أكبر، بحكم ما تتميز به من مساحة حرية ومن دعم للصحفيين والحريات الصحفية، أن تدعم وأن تسلط الضوء أكثر وأكثر أعتقد على مسألة معاناة الصحفيين، وكذلك أن تشارك في مسألة فضح المجرمين الذين تسببوا كذلك في قتل الصحفيين، وأن لا تكون هذه المسألة موسمية، مجرد أن يقتل عدد من الصحفيين أو اليوم قتل صحفي تكلمنا عنه وبعد ذلك انتهى. لا، بعد لا يقتل الصحفي هناك مآسي كثيرة خلف هذا الصحفي الذي رحل، مآسي عائلية وأسرية وهذه الأهم في وجهة نظري، وهناك مآسي مهنية تعتمد وتنسحب على زملائه الذين يعملون في الميدان والذين قد يعني يتأثرون بشكل أو بآخر من خسارته.
Thank you very much. We have now reached the end of this conference. It's time to go on with some informal networking and around the drink for those here in the Geneva Press Club here in Geneva. Thanks so much to our panelists. These were Thomas Mason, Ousman Noor, Laura Burns, and Jean-Philippe Jutzi. Thanks very much to Jusoor International Center for Media and Development for this very interesting and very important, of course, panel discussion. Thanks to you, Mr. Mohamed Al-Hammadi, for organizing and making this event possible. And ladies and gentlemen here, ladies and gentlemen online, thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for Geneva Press Club, for all attendees. Thanks a lot.